The Rest is Politics is powered by our friends at Fuse Energy.
And Fuse is a green electricity supplier, which means they generate all their energy from renewables. And they're actually offering a new bundle for anyone who switches to Fuse. And included in this, you'll be pleased to hear, is some merch. Alastair's hoodie, baseball caps, mugs. The Rest is Politics merch you may have seen on tour.
And all you got to do to get it is go to getfuse.com/politics and use the referral code politics. And so the merch is great, but more important is actually that if you do switch to Fuse, you're going to find you get your energy cheaper than with all the other big companies.
And they invest 100% of their profits back into renewables. They also now offer 24/7 support, which you can access through the Fuse app.
So dead easy, getfuse.com/politics, referral code politics, find out how to get your merch, how to switch to Fuse, and how to save yourself money.
Welcome to The Rest is Politics Question Time with me, Rory Stewart.
And me, Alastair Campbell. Now, Rory, we got loads and loads and loads of questions about Nigel Farage and reform and Keir Starmer this week. But I think even though we were pretty foreign policy related in the main podcast, there's so much other big foreign news that we didn't even have time to do in the main podcast. So I'm going to ask you this one.
Yeah, sure.
Jacob Mardell, what do you think Vladimir Putin's reaction would be to a pro-EU revolution in Georgia?
So Georgia is an EU candidate state in the Caucasus, and it's, depending on whether it's pro-Putin or pro-Western, it's a vital route for Central Asia, for minerals, for oil coming in from Azerbaijan, for the security of that whole region. And the hope after this colour revolution 20 years ago is that as part of the breakup of the Soviet Union, it was on its route to becoming more of a liberal democracy, and it became a NATO candidate, EU candidate. An election has happened, very, very dubious election. And straight after this election, which saw a victory from a pro-Putin party, Georgian Dream, financed by a man who made his money as an oligarch in Russia, and took the election by some pretty peculiar figures coming out of minority areas of Georgia. They betrayed their voters by suddenly announcing that they're not going to push ahead with their EU membership. And this was the breaking point. A lot of the opposition were already very suspicious because this is a very authoritarian regime. It's very pro-Putin. And, it's locking up opposition people, and it's threatening, and it's issuing lists of more civil society people it's going to lock up. But this was the thing that triggered them into the streets. I'd love to talk a little bit more about this, but just give us a sense of what you've thought about the pro-EU demonstrations and what you've seen on the streets and your sense of Georgia.
What you're seeing is a country that's facing a fundamental choice about which direction it takes. Does it sort of lean into to Europe, or does it lean backwards towards Russia? And what you're seeing in the streets is incredible courage and bravery, because, as you say, these people are just getting banged up. Some of the scenes have been horrific, of these balaclava wearing security forces, some of them not even wearing uniform, but just sort of basically lifting people up, taking them out, and we assume sort of, banging them up. And these are Russian backed, sometimes Russian sponsored. And we talked in the main podcast about Notre Dame. One of the other reasons I was mesmerized by all the people watching going on was somebody who was present in a very prominent position, sitting just behind Donald Trump, was the lady we mentioned last week, the French-born Georgian president, Salome Zurabichvili. And if you look at her social media feed, she just went round the place. She had a word with Trump. She then did a post saying, good to talk to Donald Trump. He's a great friend of Georgia. He understands how awful what's happening is going on. She was photographed, obviously, with Macron. She was photographed with President of Poland. She just did the rounds, doing kind of, speed dating diplomacy. And what she's doing is incredibly brave, because she's basically saying, I'm not going to quit as president, even if you hold elections saying with your electoral council that I've lost, because I do not accept the illegitimate election on which the parliament was chosen.
And I'm glad we're recording today, because this is an absolutely critical week for her in Georgia, because it's next week that they will push in a new president and she'll become a lame duck.
Yeah.
And this is the moment, this is the 3-4 day period where the opportunity is for European leaders, for the UK to step up and get to Georgia. What needs to
Yeah.
happen is we need 3 foreign ministers, and it'd be lovely if the UK was one of them, turning up, meeting the demonstrators, saying, you're right, you should have a European future and there should be free and fair elections. Because the only person who's visited is Viktor Orban, who's immediately come out for the pro-Putin authoritarians.
Absolutely. And Rory, you were unfairly castigating me for not getting Nigel Farage on the podcast. Whilst this was happening in Notre Dame,
Yes.
because Edi Rama, Prime Minister of Albania, was sitting just behind President Zurabichvili, I sent him a message saying, I don't have a number for Salome Zurabichvili, but if you're having a word with her, can you tell her that we'd love to get her on leading? And given it's so fast moving, we would do it live. And the response came back that she'd love to, but she finds us a bit scary. Now, given what she's facing in Tbilisi, I think that is and I did get in touch with her press secretary, who understandably said that she's very, very busy. But the invitation is there and it's open. We would love to talk to the president of Georgia.
My friend Gerald Knaus, who I talk about a great deal, who works the European Stability Initiative, he thinks this is such a litmus test for the West, particularly at a time when Trump is retreating. He feels it's like Mussolini marching on Rome and everybody's saying, well, let's hope it works out. And there's a real dance going on between European leaders. You basically get the sense you've got Nordic leaders saying, well, I'll go to Georgia provided someone else will come with me. And of course, it's terrible that just at the moment when we should be saying free and fair elections, providing support for the opposition, France is so weak, Germany's so distracted, but gosh, it would be good.
I think you're right. This is more important than a lot of the other issues that are grabbing a lot of attention. Similar theme, Rory. Toma Ito. What are the implications of the Romanian Constitutional Court annulling the results of the presidential election? Will we see similar actions in other countries taken against social media-based interference? And this was the election where essentially a candidate came out of nowhere, Calin Georgescu, and he went from 5% to winning the first round of the presidential election. They've since released a lot of the intelligence stuff showing that the Russians had been absolutely bombarding people using TikTok, and this guy claimed that he had no financial support, but actually he was getting massive support, even if he didn't ask for it, from Russia. So they've annulled the entire election. It's now going to be held in the spring. Now, the lady who was second was going off into the runoff with Georgescu. She, of course, is saying this is terrible because the chances are she would have won. But others are saying, well, when you've seen this level of interference, it is right that it stopped. What do you make of it?
It's amazing. So the stakes are very, very high. So Romania is one of the European success stories. I mean, it's still challenged. It's still one of the poorer countries in Europe, but it's gone from being a very, very poor authoritarian state in 1989, joined the European Union, and actually its economy has grown very remarkably, and its democracy was settling down. As you've pointed out, this thing is unbelievable. This guy who's like kind of martial arts, horseback riding, pro-Putin, pretty obscure figure, rides to victory on the back of TikTok. There's been stuff analyzing suggesting up to 70,000 Russian accounts were involved in promoting his campaign. And they've decided to suspend the election. Now, the stakes are very high because if you're on his side, you say, oi, somebody you didn't like won the election and you've just annulled the election. This is proper dictatorship. On the other hand, if you're on the Democratic side, you say, look, if we can find evidence that Russians interfering, thank goodness we're standing up for the credibility of our elections. This is the litmus test that's going to be more and more relevant going forward in many, many elections around the world. Does democracy have the nerve to defend itself? And when it finds evidence that social media and Russian interference is stealing elections, it calls stop and recounts. What do you make of how this is going to work out? Presumably it depends how much evidence they find, right?
Listen, the election has been stopped and the first round annulled, so it will go to another election in the spring. I guess the hope of the government and of the authorities there is that the public will be at least conscious of the fact that this sudden bombardment on social media is coming from somewhere. But whether it will change the vote, we'll get to see. And of course, I still feel, I mean, as Nigel Farage said to me on Question, get over it, the war is over, you're the worst loser in history. We still haven't got to the bottom of the extent to which Russia sought to interfere in the Brexit referendum. The Americans still haven't got to the bottom. We're going to be talking to Bill Clinton soon, and he, in his book, his new book, is absolutely clear that Putin played a role in Trump's victory in 2016. So I think we have been very, very, very cavalier. On the one hand, we're very keen to say Putin's a terribly bad man and he invades countries, but where it affects us, we want to look away. You remember that pathetic press conference that Johnson did with Lavrov. Lavrov said, no, we didn't get involved in the Brexit referendum at all. And Johnson basically just sort of like a nodding dog and say, look, see what they're saying. The same as Trump. I mean, he preferred to believe Putin's version of events to those of his own intelligence agencies. So I think this is a country that is standing up against something, and it's about time.
Yeah, and let me come in on this, because we have interviewed people who have said that we've looked closely into the evidence of Russian interference in the Brexit vote, and the conclusion is that what Russia tried to do, I think Ben Wallace said this in the interview with him, that Russia tried, but it wasn't very effective. And almost certainly Boris Johnson made more difference to the Brexit vote than the Russians did. That doesn't mean that Russia hasn't been getting a lot better at it over the last 8 years, and that they're now able to operate bot factories at a scale you can't imagine. And of course, what Russia's doing all the time now is they're playing both sides. So one thing we can see with Gaza is Russia is both reinforcing messages from pro-Netanyahu Zionists, settlers, and also reinforcing messages from anti-Israeli and even anti-Semitic accounts at the same time, because what they really want to do is whip up as much stuff in the streets of Europe as they possibly can on both sides. Quick one for you. How has Mahama managed his comeback election victory in Ghana after falling short in 2016 and 2020? And just before we come to that, just to explain, this is a weird African parallel to the United States. Yeah, exactly. Where somebody who served one term, the Trump has come back again in another election later. Yeah.
This guy, John Dramani Mahama, he was president till 2016. He got booted out by the biggest margin of defeat in modern history of Ghana. Massive corruption scandals, energy crisis, and he's made a comeback. And I know Donald Trump likes to talk about his amazing landslide, which wasn't, and his incredibly huge win, which wasn't. This guy's was. He got 56.55%, the largest margin of victory in a Ghana election since 1996. Turnout, again, along with a lot of elections this year, pretty disappointing, 60%. So he's back.
Ghana has been through a pretty tricky time, partly because of debt crisis, actually some serious problems on its borders with potential jihadi militants. But it was seen as the great success story of Africa. And when I was the DFID minister, we were on the verge of stopping British development funding because it looked like it was going to become a middle-income country and there wasn't any need to focus on Ghana anymore, etc. When I was a junior minister, rather unusually, I was invited to Downing Street to sit with Theresa May and the Ghanaian president, the man that's just stepped down. And it was a real privilege because often as a junior minister, you're not brought into these three ways with heads of state. And it was the funniest thing you've ever seen. Just the three of us, and Nana sits down with Theresa May, and he says, now, Prime Minister May, I wonder whether I could give you some unsolicited advice on the basis of my experience. He's older than her. I think it's time for you to consider holding a second referendum and rejoining the European Union.
Good man.
And I thought what was so funny about it is that obviously I'm going around the world lecturing African heads of state all the time in the same way. And now the boot's on the other foot.
Yeah. This is, by the way, it's the fifth country our theme of incumbency. It's the fifth African country this year to see the opposition winning.
The stats are that basically incumbents are shedding votes every time, and they're losing, I think, 85 times out of 100 at the moment. I mean, it's and that's partly what's going on in the US. That's something that will keep Keir Starmer up at night. That's something that's going to be worrying Macron. It's definitely a problem for Schulz. And it's a problem for stability of politics everywhere. I mean, we basically, and I think it's a sense of a more generic crisis, isn't it? That
Yeah.
it doesn't matter whether you're Ghana or Britain or the US, our systems are not delivering for people in the way they like. Social media is whipping up so much anger and opposition, and the general response is just boot the government out.
Well, talking of an incumbent who's been in a bit of difficulty, we got we got a lot of questions about South Korea. Will Goulburn, was the president's declaration of martial law an attempted coup? Kev, please could you provide a concise explanation for what happened in South Korea? Well, what happened was that the president declared martial law, totally out of the blue. Nobody could quite understand where this was coming from. And immediately there was, in a way, it showed sort of politics and political reaction working well, in that people took to the streets, there was a lot of protest. Parliamentarians, the troops tried to bar them from entering parliament, but they managed to get in and they had a vote. And it quickly became clear that the mood of the country and the mood of the parliament was against what he's done. There was then a move to impeach him, just needed 8 of his own MPs to turn, but they didn't. So the impeachment failed, but the protests are still going on, essentially trying to get rid of President Yoon. It was an amazing 24 hours, though. You talk about the world of, I mean, the world, you kind of look at that, wherever you look in the world at the moment, you just think, is there nothing but turmoil? But this was like, this one kind of came out of nowhere.
Yeah. The reason it matters is this is one of the wealthiest countries in the world in terms of its GDP and GDP per capita. A real economic miracle because it was one of the poorest countries in the world. So we've just been talking about Ghana. South Korea was significantly poorer than Ghana in 1945. And GDP per capita now in South Korea is running in nominal terms at probably $55,000 a year,
Mm.
when GDP in Ghana will probably be down at most a couple of thousand on a PPP basis, which means that it's gone from being poorer than Ghana to being, you know, multiples richer in simply, sorry, I think probably 25 times richer, uh, simply over the period of the last 50, 60 years. And it became a democracy in 1987. So a lot of that growth, and this is another weird thing that confuses economists, was under a time of quite a lot of protectionism and tariffs and military rules. So it was a bit of an outlier in our general idea of free markets and liberal democracy. Became a democracy in 1987, is one of the great democratic success stories, is one of the US's central allies. The US has 25,000 troops in South Korea, so that's 10 times the number it had in Afghanistan. And of course, it's one of the great flashpoints of the world because
Yeah.
North Korea arming itself with missiles, allying with Russia, sending troops into Ukraine. So eh, that's why it's not just a sort of cheerful kind of detail that the president has triggered martial law or tried to trigger martial law. For South Korea, that's, oh my goodness, are we retreating to the 1980s? And for global security, what on earth is one of the wealthiest, most democratic countries on earth doing
Yeah.
going into these kind of problems?
But I think one of the reasons why the response was so immediate and so strong amongst the public was because they do have memories of martial law and they have memories of those pre-democracy days. So it was quite moving, actually, the response. And the thing you said about their kind of growing wealth, this relates to the point about incumbency, is the extent to which people will take that for granted and then be wanting more, particularly if they have a sense of it containing massive inequality. And one of the reasons why there was this kind of real opposition to him actually is because of his wife. And this has been a big scandal in South Korea for some time about the sort of her lifestyle. And we're seeing this. I'm not comparing Yoon to Assad, and I'm not comparing her to Asma Assad, but you know, one of the things that's emerging now out of Syria is just the sheer wealth that they had. There's this amazing video. I don't know if you saw it, Rory, of inside Assad's garage, of his own personal collection of virtually every luxury car brand in the world. And likewise, his wife, sort of, vast personal wealth. Now, that is not the same in South Korea, but in terms of the profile of Yoon's wife, it has been a lot of it focused on this sense of her being living a life that people don't expect from the wife of a president who's not on the sort of money that oligarchs are.
Final fact on South Korea, which I think links to a lot of the stuff we talk about, is its fertility rate. So, on average, couples are having 0.8 children. that means that the population is on track to halve. So we're talking Britain, where our population is growing. South Korean population, more than anywhere on earth. I mean, by the end of this century, will be half the size it is now, unless they sort out the fertility rate. And of course, that also means that it's going to get much, much older. The young people will collapse as the old people expand. You end up with a crazy inverted pyramid, and that's going to trigger a massive economic crisis in one of the major world economies, which is the biggest Western ally in the region, along with Japan.
You had your vision, your image of Joe Biden as not just a lame duck, but a duck without legs. This guy remains president, but he's not allowed to travel anywhere. So we have this sense of career, very stable and what have you. But actually, it's got a very checkered history in terms of assassinations, in terms of attempted coups, in terms of toppling of regimes. But this seems to be a sort of a self-imposed toppling that is still underway.
So this is a question that's coming from Nicole, and the question is, why has there been so little coverage of Keir Starmer's speech?
I must, by the way, I must complain about the BBC. I'm not one of my usual rants, but so as you know, Question Time is recorded a couple of hours before it goes out. So it was the first issue raised when I was on Question Time in Lincoln last week. And at one point, Fiona Bruce, for whom I have a lot of time, by the way, I don't join in all the Fiona Bruce bashing, she said, so Alastair, we've had 3 foundations, 5 missions, 6 of this, and now we've got these 5 or 6 or 7 milestones, which Nigel Farage calls them millstones. And she sort of said, it wouldn't have happened in your day. And I just sort of sighed and let out a little kind of nothing. And they used it on the 10 o'clock news.
Oh.
Of my reaction. So not allowing me to do my tribal defense, Rory. This was very annoying.
Well, let's give you a very, very short time for your tribal defense. Give us the defense, and then tell us what could be done better to get around this problem. Yeah.
Tribal defense would be that there has been so much going on in and around the government, in and around the world, that the sense of those first weeks where the government was absolutely clear about its overall strategy hasn't really landed. And this was his attempt to sort of land it and make sure this is what we're doing. These are the missions. These are the things by which we want to be judged. Judge us by them. Now we're going to get on with it. There was a huge amount of coverage on the day, by the way, huge. Led the news all day, pretty much. Covered live on all the news channels. Wall of cynicism across the media next day.
Yep.
Come the weekend, it was almost as if it hadn't happened.
Can I just comment on that? That is a sort of an issue, isn't it? Because I do think if you were thinking about strategic comms, yes, of course, it's amazing to dominate the coverage on the day. But it's the longer burn that matters in terms of the public remembering. I mean, what will worry me is if you and I were to ask an audience in 3 weeks' time, how clear a memory would they have had? And what is it that makes the difference between comms that dominate the news on a day and comms that really sinks into the public imagination? So they think, okay, Labour's got a plan, Labour's got a mission, and I can tell you what it is.
I think it is harder in the modern age because of social media, cynicism, lack, kind of just a general anti-politics mood. But I think in a way, you really have to work at what is it you're saying that relates to what you've said before and what you're doing into the future. I think Keir Starmer is somebody who finds it irritating that people like me talk about narrative, talk about the importance of narrative. He would argue politics and government isn't about narrative, it's about doing stuff and fixing stuff. Both things are true. But if you're just saying you're doing things and you're fixing stuff, there's a real danger that you come over as being a bit technocratic. And leadership ultimately isn't about technocratic stuff. It's about signaling where you're going and then showing, and above all, effecting in people's lives the changes that you've been talking about. So if you come along and say, I mean, I actually think the missions, we've talked about the missions before, I think the missions are a perfectly good strategic way to approach the government, but they haven't landed. Why haven't they landed? Because there hasn't been that sense of consistent drumbeat of the same things being said and done again and again. So the minute you allow your opponents to talk about it being a reset, essentially you're saying, well, okay, this is what we're trying to do, but we haven't quite landed it yet.
Got you.
One of the points I made on, I can't remember whether I made it with you or on Question Time, but I'll make it again because I think it's really important Labour understand this. This is the message from what's happened in America. It's the message about this thing about incumbency. It's the message about what's happening to Scholz and Albanese, two very similar left of centre leaders who, to some, have done some good things well, but are just not getting credit, but getting loads of blame for the stuff they're not doing well. In the modern age, you have to do even more than deliver. The delivery is what the public say, well, that's what you're there for.
Yeah.
You said you were going to do that, so
Yeah.
you've done that. We want more than that. We also want leadership. We also want to we want to know what song we're meant to be singing with you.
Yeah. I'm often attacked at the moment for being too consensual, probably because I'm always accused, in fact, of being intimidated by you, Alastair, and not being
brainwashed, Rory.
brainwashed and not being brutal enough about Labour. So here, to remind people, Keir Starmer's net popularity rating at the moment is minus 38. At this period, Tony Blair's, this long after the election, was about plus 60. This is fantastically unpopular. It's not far off how unpopular Liz Truss was. And, I saw Keir Starmer on Wednesday, and I was struck by how relaxed he was, how engaged he was, how graceful. I've seen a number of Labour ministers this week. They seem pretty chipper and feeling good about themselves. But I'm afraid you're right that there's a real problem out there, which they're not quite picking up on, which is a lot of the public is in danger of being seriously uninspired. And the problems that we face in our society require such radical solutions that just doing the job well and seriously and hoping that that'll be enough won't work.
It's interesting, though, that you noticed his temperament. I do think his temperament is incredibly important in this. He doesn't, although there is he knows that a lot of people out there are a bit pissed off. He reads the numbers. He knows that his popularity ratings have kind of plummeted, but it doesn't seem to be getting to him in a way that would make him struggle even more. Now, that's a good thing. I'll tell you what I think is a bad thing. I'm reading far too much in the coverage of the government, the extent to which what they're doing, and that speech in particular, as an electoral strategy for the next time around. They've got to watch that, because the truth is that they're a new government still. It might feel like they've been there for a long time. So the focus has got to be, rightly, this is what Keir Starmer does focus on, fixing the problems. But it should be about fixing the problems because this is the Britain we're trying to create, not fixing the problems, otherwise we won't win the next election.
And characteristically, when we spoke, and I hope he doesn't mind me saying this, when I said, things that he was doing that I admire that he was doing, his immediate answer is, yeah, well, we got a lot of problems to fix. So there is the past thing, which I think is probably important for them politically, which is to register what the Tories screwed up. But there's also the future thing. What's the vision of the country? We did have some questions on the Cattery banquet. So this was, I went to the state banquet, and for people who don't follow this stuff, you will have done this too. It's an amazing event where if there's a state visit, where a head of state visits Britain, you'll see all the flags going down the Mall. This is what Donald Trump did in 2019 when I was in the cabinet. And then the state banquet is held in Buckingham Palace. And it's a thing where you all turn up in white tie and tails. And actually, Keir Starmer was looking very, very smart and relaxed in this quite kind of formal 19th century costume. And the state guests were held at one end of the table. It's very, very, very lavish. The king welcomed the emir with some Arabic, and he pushed on with some pretty difficult Arabic pronunciation. And it was really useful afterwards, because I think what people don't get so much is that you've got an hour before the event and actually an hour and a half after, in small groups, where you're able to talk to the Qatari Prime Minister, the Emir, and where senior British officials, the Chief of the Defence Staff, the head of our intelligence services, the head of the Foreign Office, the Prime Minister, the Foreign Secretary, are able to do quite detailed informal conversations. Ed Miliband was there talking about energy and climate change. We've also had a question from Daniel Nicol, and this may be the moment to flip round to you. This week, Prince William, creator of the Earthshot Prize, had a warm and friendly meeting with Donald Trump. As a Year 5 primary school teacher of children who care deeply about the climate, how on earth am I meant to teach them to stand up to bullies and bullying behaviours, whilst world leaders pussyfoot around Trump? Why aren't we calling Trump out for his othering, populist, climate-destroying rhetoric? So my view, of course, is strongly supportive of what Prince William's doing. I think it's incredibly important that we keep links with the United States, and in some ways, the royal family doing it can provide some interesting alternative cover for the government. It can be less embarrassing, less high profile than the Prime Minister engaging. And I certainly don't think it makes sense for the royal family to be the people mounting big public political criticisms of people. I think that's something more for politicians. But anyway, over to you.
Although I remember one very, very, very tricky state visit when we were in power, which was China. Jiang Zemin came, and your friend the King, who was then the Prince of Wales, was very, very clear that he was not going to get involved. So they can make choices. I think you're right. I mean, in fact, one of the questions on Question Time was how should the new government handle Donald Trump? And of course, Nigel Farage was full of it. I did make the point that, I think most British people wish that Trump wasn't president, but he is. And the British government has to engage and deal with him. It's certainly not the job of the Prince of Wales to call him out on policy. I think you're right. I think that in terms of our, you saw that with the way that Trump talks about. Trump basically sees himself as a monarch.
Yes.
When he's sitting down with Keir Starmer or Olaf Scholz, he doesn't think he's dealing with his equal. When he's sitting down with the Queen, when she was alive, when he's sitting down with the King. So Prince William is like he's somewhere between the King and the Prime Minister.
Well, Trump's also incredibly interested in celebrity, isn't he? And of course, the other thing is that our royal family is incredibly famous in the US. So he loves famous people, yeah.
And also he loves the idea that these are people that you don't really criticize, because he wants to be one of those as well. I was talking to somebody in the Qatari government a few months before our election who was asking me whether I thought the Labour government, if and when it came in, would want to engage with Qatar, or just to make it the issue of human rights, workers' rights, and so forth, a big problem between them, as it were. And I said, well, I think that what's going to happen is that if you get a Labour government knows that it's going to have to, if its number one mission is growing the economy, it's going to have to appeal to countries like Qatar to get engaged and to get involved in foreign direct investment and so forth. And that is, I guess, part of the reason why the state visit went in the way that it did. It was very much signalling that approach.
It's also interesting the ways in which British soft power works. So the Emir of Qatar went to school in England, went to Harrow. He also, like many of the Qataris I was talking to, had been to Sandhurst, to our military academy. And that's true for a lot of the monarchs in the Gulf. Interestingly, the very most senior people both mentioned to me that they'd been listening to the podcast. That's obviously, it's sort of ridiculous boast on my behalf, but it's just a sort of example, I suppose, more of the way in which Britain, English language media, continues to keep us quite central to people's awareness in a way that may not be true even for very major economies like Germany. Serious question, Yasmin A. I'd like to hear your thoughts on Putin's current position in relation to Assad after personally granting him asylum. Also, what's it like to be an exiled dictator?
You asked that question as though I am an exiled
You were
dictator,
Idi Amin.
and I'll
Well,
be
you
able to
are in
explain that.
France. You are in France, and
I don't
Macron is
feel
a
I'm
friend
in
of
exile.
yours.
Well, I don't feel I'm in exile. I'm in a place from which our country has been exiled by one of the most stupid decisions any country's ever taken. Look, I think the Putin situation is fascinating on so many levels because the Russian state media has said that Putin personally granted this decision that Assad should be given asylum in Russia. I said to you when we did the emergency episode on Sunday that I could sense something was going on because of the way Lavrov was talking. The deal had already been done. He was basically en route as that discussion was going on. And I don't know where Assad is. I imagine that they'll have some sort of luxury set up for them. So Assad and his wife and whichever inner circle are with them, got 3 kids in their 20s. So they're there. We don't know where. We don't know how they're going to live. They are unbelievably wealthy because, like Putin, they've stashed money all around the world. So they won't have any sort of financial worries, but they'll have political worries. And let's be frank, this is a defeat they never thought was going to come.
Yeah, and of course, as Guy Burgess and Kim Philby, our great spies, found when they went to Moscow, the weather's not that great if you come from the Syrian Mediterranean and you find yourself suddenly stuck in Moscow through the winter. So we're pretty miserable about it. We're just wondering whether it ever really ends well for dictators. It can be pretty grim and mad. But it's even worse if they won't take you. Remember, famously, there was a great controversy about the fact the British royal family panicked in 1916-17 and signaled that they wouldn't take the Romanov family, the Tsars of Russia, who were then killed by the revolutionaries.
Final point on the Assads, Rory. I mentioned the other day about this big profile that Vogue magazine did, where it really was awful. The headline was "The Rose in the Desert," and it was a real sort of puff job. But eventually, after this sort of outcry, this is one of my favourite ever statements. Vogue said, this is when they took the article down from their website. As the terrible events of the past year and a half unfolded in Syria, it's become clear that Syria's priorities and values are at odds with those of Vogue.
Very good. Okay. Thank you, Alastair. Bye.
Bye.